Jai Janin. We are talking about Maargana today. We have to understand that there are 14 steps of purity. Placement of living beings on these 14 steps of purity is known as Maargana. There are 14 ways a living being can be placed on these steps of purity. First placement is of the living beings in their realms of existence. There are 4 realms. These are human form, Tiryansh form, hellish form, and heavenly form. Let's see how each of these forms is placed on the 14 steps of purity to understand the first Maargana, which is the Gati Maargana. The heavenly form. This living being has its placement from first to fourth steps of purity. Heavenly forms of living beings lives with a false perception all their life, completely driven by lower emotions of anger, pride, deceit, and greed. However, when this living being undergoes realization of the truth that all his desires for belongings is false, the living being may hop from the first step of false perception directly to the fourth step of true perception. So heavenly beings has placement from the first to the fourth steps of purity. Next is hellish form. Hellish form of living beings has placement also from the first to the fourth steps of purity. A hellish being is also driven by emotions of anger, pride, deceit, and greed. However, these beings also undergo an intensive feeling of suffering and pain, which actually results in their realization, if they want to realize, that the chasing of desires and longings and wantings, this is all a false reality. Then the living being hops from the hell of its first step of false perception to the fourth step of purity. Such realization comes mostly again due to their sufferings in the hellish state. Now comes the Tiryansh forms. The Tiryansh forms of living beings has placement from the first to the fifth steps of purity. Majority of the Tiryansh living beings, they live with a false perception of the world, again driven by the lower emotions of anger, pride, deceit, and ego, and thus they are at the first step of purity. When any Tiryansh being makes effort to realize that the desires for belongings is false, living being hops from the first step of false perception to the fourth step of true perception, which is clarity, also known as Samyak Darshan. And when this Tiryansh being makes another effort at this fourth step towards true conduct and takes up virtuous attitude, then a Tiryansh being goes one step further to the fifth step of purity. All 1 to 4 sense Tiryansh beings are at step 1, which is false perception. 5 sensed beings without man are also at the first step, which is false perception. Only the Tiryansh beings which have 5 senses and man with them are known as Sangi Tiryansh, and these have the capacity to jump to the fourth step and then to the fifth step when they make an effort. At this time, Maher asked one question. If at any instance of time these beings lose one of their senses, let's say they lose their sight sense or they lose their hearing sense, do they lose their ability to gain clarity or Samyak Darshan, and thus they will not be able to jump to the fourth step of purity? The answer is no. So we have to understand here that all our 5 senses are of 2 kinds. One is Dravya, which is the external structural form of the five senses, and another is the bhavendriya, which is the power behind the five senses. The power of seeing, the power of sight is never lost, despite the external eye structure may damage. However, you can always get it surgery and remove and change it for a better structure on the outer version, and you can start seeing back again. So the power of senses is never lost. You are still a five sensed being despite any structure on the outside gets damaged. Let's go to the fourth form now, final, which is the human form. The human form of living being has placement from the first to the 14 steps of purity. When in a state of false perception, they are at the first step of purity, and majority of us are all at the first step of purity, which is false perception, and thus we are very much driven by the emotions all the time of anger, pride, deceit, and greed. After realization that nothing of the world belongs to him or her and everything is just a transition, a human being hops to the fourth step of purity. At fourth step, when a human being takes efforts of virtuous attitude, that time this human being moves one step further to the fifth step of purity. With every effort towards the purity of the self, this human being moves further and more further and higher to the above steps. At step 13th, such human being with utmost purity is realized as an arihant, and after the 14th step, the human being sheds off its worldly form and becomes siddha. So Devin asked a question at this time: can we see these human beings at different steps while ourselves are still at the step first? So the answer is yes. For example, we are in false perception right now because we are constantly driven by our lower emotions and we believe in our belongings and possessions. And while still at the first step, we see a form, human form, for example, a Muni Maharaji. A Muni Maharaji is at the sixth or the seventh step of purity. All these kind of purity is actually taking place within us. It's hardly to realize from the external form that what is the purity of the person, but actually the state is happening inside us. If we were born in the fourth era of time, we are right now in the fifth era of time. In the fourth era of time, if we were born, then we being still at the first or the fourth step of purity, we could have still seen and done darshan of a Tirthankar who would have been at that time at the 13th step of consciousness. For example, we meet Vrati people who have taken vows in their life. They are at the fifth step of purity. So we at the first step or the fourth step, if we have clarity, we can see a person sitting beside us who is at the fifth step of purity. So this way, the whole human beings are at different steps of purity depending on their internal state, how much they have understood and realized the truth of the world. The next Maargana will be discussed in the next class. Thank you.